They told us it was a parasite from the river, a natural plague sweeping through the villages. But the microscope told a different story. This wasn't a disease. It was poison. A poison delivered in sacks of food in aid meant to save them. We had the proof, the scientific truth that could stop the dying. But what do you do when the men in charge order you to bury it? When saving lives means becoming a criminal, and the truth is far more dangerous than the lie. The air in the Gulu clinic was a thick, wet blanket, heavy with the smells of antiseptic, sweat, and something else, the sweet metallic scent of sickness. Flies, fat and lazy, droned in the oppressive heat, their buzzing a constant maddening soundtrack to the quiet desperation of the room. Dr. David Okello felt a bead of sweat trace a path down his temple, but he didn't dare wipe it away. Both of his hands were occupied, holding down the small, frail body of 9-year-old Joseph. The boy's limbs trembled, a grand mal seizure that shook his entire frame. But it was the other movement, the one that persisted with a horrifying rhythm that defined this plague. Joseph's head nodded. Violently, mechanically, it dipped down and snapped back, down and back. A grotesque pendulum that seemed entirely disconnected from the rest of his thrashing body. His eyes, wide and unfocused, were vacant, seeing nothing of the room, nothing of the doctor holding him, nothing of his mother who knelt in the corner, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, exhausted sobs. Okello held the boy steady, his own muscles aching with the strain. His face was a mask of professional composure, but his eyes held a deep, familiar grief. He glanced at the worn watch on his wrist, the second hand sweeping with an agonizing slowness. 1 minute. 1 minute and 30 seconds. He was a scientist, a man of medicine. He measured, he timed, he recorded. It was the only way to impose a shred of order onto this devouring chaos. The convulsions began to subside, Joseph's limbs going limp, but the nodding continued. Down and back, down and back. A puppet whose strings had been seized by some invisible, malevolent hand. Okello finally released the boy, his own breath coming out in a ragged sigh. He moved to his small desk, picked up a worn clipboard, and made a note on the chart. Episode duration, 2 minutes, 14 seconds. A tonic seizure with persistent head nodding. Below it, he made another mark in a growing tally. The 15th case this month. And it was only the 8th of the month. He looked from his clipboard to the small, unnervingly still boy, and for a moment, the doctor's mask slipped. He was just a man, watching a child's mind be stolen from the inside out, and he had no idea why. He stepped out of the clinic, and the full force of the Ugandan sun hit him like a physical blow. He squinted, the world outside bleached white and shimmering with heat. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the brief respite from the clinic's stifling air doing little to ease the tightness in his chest. His gaze swept over the village. It should have been noisy with the sounds of children playing, their laughter carrying on the dry breeze. Instead, there was a profound and unsettling quiet. He saw them, scattered in the shade of the acacia trees, sitting listlessly in the dust, the lost ones. Some rocked back and forth, their own heads performing that same terrible rhythmic nod. Others just stared, their eyes holding the same vacancy he had just seen in Joseph's. An entire generation being hollowed out before his very eyes. An old woman, her skin a beautiful map of deep-carved wrinkles, caught his eye. It was Elena, a village elder whose memory stretched back further than anyone else's. She stood straight and proud, her gaze unwavering. She lifted a thin, gnarled arm and pointed not at the clinic, but towards the faint shimmer of the Achwa River, miles away. With her other hand, she made a traditional gesture, a flick of the wrist to ward off evil. Her voice, when she spoke in her native Okello, was raspy but clear, carrying across the dusty clearing. "It is the river that is angry," she said. "Gemu. The river devil has woken up, and it is taking their minds. Okello met her gaze and gave a slow, tired nod of respect. He understood her need to give the horror a name, a face. But in the quiet, rational fortress of his mind, he dismissed it. It wasn't a devil. It was a pathogen, a toxin, a vector. It was something he could find, isolate, and fight. It had to be. To believe otherwise was to surrender. The drone of the flies was suddenly joined by a different sound, a deeper, mechanical whine from above. He looked up, shielding his eyes, and saw the small propeller plane descending towards the dusty, sun-baked airstrip just outside the village. Help, he thought, with a feeling that was less hope and more weary resignation. The outside world had finally arrived. The plane, a small Cessna, kicked up a storm of red dust as it landed. The door opened and two figures emerged into the heat. The first was a man in his 50s, European, dressed in a crisp linen suit that was already beginning to wilt. This was Marcus Thorne, the picture of detached, bureaucratic authority. Before his feet had even settled on the Ugandan soil, he had a satellite phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp and clinical. "The key is to manage the optics," he was saying. "We need to project control." The second figure was a woman in her 30s, Dr. Anya Sharma. She was the opposite of Thorne in every way. Dressed in practical cargo pants and a sweat-wicked shirt, she ignored the official greeting party and Thorne's power broking. Her dark, intense eyes were already scanning everything, absorbing data. She unslung a bag and pulled out a small handheld device, immediately beginning to take environmental readings. The air quality, the soil temperature, the background radiation. She was an epidemiologist, and the world was her laboratory. She moved with a purpose that Okello recognized instantly. She wasn't here for the optics. She was here for the answers. Evening fell, but brought no relief from the heat. The tiny cluttered office in the clinic was illuminated by a single naked bulb that cast long dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and coffee. Okello stood beside a large map of the district, which was peppered with red pins. Each pin was a child. Each pin was a life dissolving. Marcus Thorne sat behind Okello's desk as if it were his own, exuding an air of unearned command. He outlined the official WHO preliminary thesis, his voice smooth and certain. The consensus from Geneva is that we're looking at Onchocerciasis, river blindness. The black flies from the Achwa River are the vector, carrying the parasitic worm Onchocerca volvulus. He gestured vaguely at the map. It's a tragedy, of course, but a known quantity, contained. We'll focus our efforts on vector control, pesticide spraying and distributing ivermectin. Clean, simple, effective. He delivered the words with an air of finality, as if the mystery had been solved by a committee thousands of miles away. But Dr. Sharma wasn't looking at him. Her sharp gaze was fixed on the constellation of red pins. She stepped forward and pointed to a dense cluster on the eastern edge of the map. "But this cluster," she said, her voice cutting through Thorne's smug certainty. "It's a full 5 kilometers from the river. Black flies don't have that kind of range. The data doesn't fit the model." She looked at Okello, then back at Thorne. "And the demographics? Why only children between the ages of 5 and 15? River blindness affects all ages. This is selective. Something else is happening here." Thorne waved a dismissive hand, the gesture of a man brushing away an inconvenient fly. "Anomalies, Doctor. Outliers. In a crisis, you can't get bogged down in every statistical ghost. We need a clear, actionable narrative for the aid agencies and the press." He looked directly at Okello, his eyes cold and commanding. "A narrative that shows we have the situation under control." Okello looked from the map, his map with its pins representing children he knew by name, to Thorne's confident, unyielding face. He heard Sharma's sharp, logical questions questions that echoed the very doubts festering in his own mind. And he heard Thorne's talk of narratives and optics, not of patience and causes. In that moment, under the swinging glare of the single bulb, a seed of cold, terrifying doubt about the men who had come to save them began to take root. The sun was a merciless hammer over the banks of the Achwa River. Heat radiated up from the dark, muddy soil in shimmering waves, and the air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing water. Dressed in heavy protective gear, Dr. Okello and Dr. Sharma worked in a grim, sweaty silence, their movements methodical and practiced. They were setting the traps, black, cone-shaped contraptions coated with a sticky substance, designed to attract and capture the black flies that were the official enemy. The work was frustrating. The gear was stifling, and the ground itself seemed to fight them, sucking at their boots with every step. As they worked, Sharma, ever the scientist, recited the life cycle of Onchocerciasis volvulus, as if reading from a textbook. "The female fly requires a blood meal to lay her eggs," she explained, her voice slightly muffled by her face mask. She ingests the microfilariae from an infected human. Inside the fly's gut, they develop over 2 weeks into infective larvae. When she bites another human, the larvae enter the new host. It's an efficient, if horrifying, biological machine. Okello grunted in response, his focus elsewhere. He listened to her words, the clean, logical progression of a scientific fact, but it all felt hollow out here, abstract. His gaze was fixed on a small group of children splashing and laughing in the shallow part of the river, no more than 50 meters away. They were barefoot, wearing shorts, their skin exposed. They were healthy, vibrant, alive. He straightened up, his back aching, and looked from the children back to the trap in his hand. "Anya," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "If the flies are here, if this river is the heart of the infection, why are they fine?" He gestured with his chin towards the playing children. "And why is it that Joseph, who lives 5 kilometers away and never comes to the river, is sick? Why is his entire village full of the lost ones, while these children are untouched?" Sharma stopped working. She followed his gaze, her brow furrowing. She saw the impossible contradiction playing out in front of them. The supposed ground zero of the epidemic was a picture of health, while the sickness festered miles away from its alleged source. The clean, simple hypothesis they were sent here to confirm was being dismantled by reality itself. She opened her mouth to offer a theory, perhaps intermittent breeding cycles or localized immunity, but no words came out. For the first time since her arrival, the brilliant Dr. Sharma had no immediate answer, and the uncertainty in her eyes was more telling than any explanation. Night fell, and the makeshift laboratory, a canvas tent humming with the chug of a portable generator, became their sanctuary. Inside, the air was still hot, but it was a focused heat, lit by the sterile white glow of their equipment. Sharma hunched over a microscope, her focus absolute. Okello assisted, preparing the slides, carefully isolating the tiny black flies they had trapped and placing them under her lens. It was a ritual of mounting frustration, slide after slide, fly after fly. "Negative," Sharma would mutter, pushing one slide aside and reaching for another. No microfilariae present in the thoracic muscles. Okello would hand her the next one. The process repeated. The pile of discarded negative slides grew. The numbers didn't lie. The flies were not carrying the parasite, not in any significant number. The official theory wasn't just cracked, it was crumbling to dust before their eyes. The tent flap was pushed aside, and Marcus Thorne stepped in, bringing with him a gust of the humid night air. He glanced at the microscope, at their tired, frustrated faces, and at the discouraging pile of slides. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed his features before being replaced by his usual mask of bland authority. "It takes time, doctors," he said, his tone patronizingly patient. "These things don't happen overnight. Just keep to the protocol." He straightened his shirt, as if the very sight of their work had soiled it. "I just wanted to let you know, the press release about our new vector control initiative goes out tomorrow morning. A very positive piece about our decisive action. He was looking at them, but he wasn't seeing them. He didn't ask about their findings. He didn't care about the data. He cared only about the report of action, the illusion of progress. He gave a thin, satisfied smile, then turned and left, leaving them in the buzzing silence of the tent. Sharma stared at the empty space where he had been, her knuckles white as she gripped the focus knob of the microscope. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice a low, bitter whisper. He's not looking for a cause. He's looking for a culprit. The next day, Okello made a house call. The dim interior of Joseph's hut was a familiar, heartbreaking scene. The boy sat on the packed earth floor, his small body rocking back and forth, his head performing its ceaseless, rhythmic nod. He was unresponsive, lost in the prison of his own mind. His mother, a woman who now looked twice her age, moved with the slow, weary grace of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to hope. She thanked Okello for coming, though they both knew there was little he could do. She offered him a small bowl of maize porridge, a gesture of hospitality that was as automatic as breathing. As he politely declined, his eyes fell upon the source of the meal, a large, white polypropylene sack leaning against the wall, its side stamped with the familiar blue logo of an international food aid organization. He was fine before the trucks came, Joseph's mother said, her voice a monotone of grief. She wasn't looking at Okello, but at her son. For a year after the fighting stopped, he was a happy boy. Then the white sacks of grain arrived. That is when the Gemu came. She lowered her voice, as if afraid of being overheard by the spirits. It is a curse. The river devil has poisoned the foreign food to punish us. Okello listened, his mind automatically categorizing her words as folklore, a desperate attempt to connect two unrelated events and create a narrative for her suffering. A classic cognitive bias. He murmured some comforting, non-committal words, but even as his rational mind dismissed the superstition, his physician's eyes lingered on the sack. He saw the way it was stored, low to the ground, in the damp, cool corner of the hut. He noted the fine, powdery dust that coated its base, a curse that followed the grain. The thought was absurd, and yet it refused to leave him. Dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, but the mood in the village was grey. Thorn had called a meeting with the elders, determined to win them over with the sheer force of his authority. Okello stood beside him, tasked with translating Thorn's sterile, bureaucratic pronouncements into the rich, nuanced language of the Okello. "We will be initiating a comprehensive larvicidal spraying program," Thorn announced with a confident smile, as if offering a great gift. Okello translated, though the words for larvicidal and program felt alien and clumsy on his tongue. Thorn spoke of medical protocols and distribution matrices, his tone patronizing, his message utterly disconnected from the fearful, grieving people sitting before him. He was interrupted. Elena, the old woman who had spoken to Okello by the clinic, rose to her feet. She was no longer just a frail elder. She seemed to draw strength from the collective fear of her community, her presence filling the clearing. She pointed a long, trembling finger directly at Thorn. "Your metal birds that scream in the sky," she cried out, her voice ringing with righteous anger. Okello translated, his own voice quiet. "Your white powders that poison the earth. They mean nothing. You have disturbed the river, and now the Gemu is angry." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Thorn, flustered, tried to speak, but Elena's voice rose above him. "It follows your white sacks of grain," she declared, her accusation echoing what Joseph's mother had said. "The sickness came with your food. You brought this curse to our children." The murmur grew into a low roar of assent. Thorn stood frozen, his confident smile gone, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. He was a man armed with statistics and protocols, facing a wave of pure, primal emotion, and his weapons were useless. Okello looked away from Thorn and into the faces of his people. He saw their fear, but he also saw their conviction. In the absence of a credible explanation from the men of science, they had created their own. And in that moment, Okello realized that Thorne's approach wasn't just failing, it was pouring fuel on a fire. The small windowless storage room behind the clinic had been converted into a makeshift morgue. It was a place Dr. Okello had entered too many times in the past month. Tonight, its grim purpose was heavier than ever. Another child was gone, a 7-year-old girl named Sarah. Her parents, their faces carved with a grief so profound it had no more tears, had given their quiet, heartbroken permission. They didn't understand the science, but they understood Dr. Okello's desperate need to find an answer. By the flickering golden light of a single gas lantern, he and Dr. Sharma worked in a tense, reverent silence. This was a line they had never thought they would cross. An unauthorized autopsy, performed in secret, was a profound violation of every protocol they were bound to. But the official protocols had failed. The official theory was a lie. The rules had become a cage, and the only way to the truth was to break out. The task was heartbreaking. Every precise incision, every careful extraction was a fresh wave of sorrow. This was not a specimen. This was a child who had, just a few weeks ago, been full of life. Finally, they had what they needed, a small sample of brain tissue. Sharma carried it to the portable microscope set up on a crate in the corner. Okello watched, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The lantern light cast their shadows, huge and distorted, against the concrete walls. Sharma adjusted the lens, her eye pressed to the scope, her breathing steady. The silence stretched, thick and absolute. Okello could hear nothing but the faint hiss of the lantern, then a sharp intake of breath from Sharma. "David," she whispered, her voice tight. "Come look." He moved to her side, his body tense. He leaned down, took her place at the eyepiece, and looked. He wasn't sure what he expected to see. The telltale signs of the Onchocerciasis parasite, perhaps, proving them wrong all along. But it was something else entirely. The neural pathways were a disaster zone. There was widespread inflammation, cellular decay. But it wasn't the work of a worm. It was damage of a different sort. Chemical. Corrosive. "Do you see the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum?" Sharma's voice was barely audible, trembling with the shock of discovery. "The dendritic atrophy, the necrosis. This isn't parasitic. David, this is poisoning. Specifically mycotoxin damage." Okello straightened up, his mind racing. Mycotoxins, a poisonous byproduct of fungus. A type of fungus commonly, almost exclusively, found in improperly stored grain. He looked from the microscope to Sharma, whose eyes were wide in the lantern light, reflecting a mixture of horror and grim vindication. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The curse that followed the grain. The sickness that came with the white sacks. It wasn't superstition, it was observation. They had found it. The scientific anchor for a terrifying, dangerous new theory. They had broken the rules, and in the heart of that violation, they had found the truth. They didn't walk, they ran. Fueled by adrenaline and a righteous, furious energy, they burst out of the morgue and across the dark compound to Thorne's office. A sterile, air-conditioned prefab container that was a world away from the grim reality they had just inhabited. They didn't knock. Okello threw the door open. Thorne was on a satellite call, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up, his face a mask of irritation at the interruption. "What is the meaning of this?" Sharma thrust her tablet onto his desk. "The meaning is that you're wrong," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "It's not the flies. It was never the flies." Okello pointed at the screen, where Sharma had already uploaded the microscope imagery and a summary of the toxicology. "It's mycotoxins, Marcus, from fungus, the kind found in spoiled maize." Thorne stared at the screen. Okello watched as the man's entire demeanor shifted. The irritation vanished, replaced by a dawning comprehension. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pale, sickly white. He understood the implication instantly, completely. His organization, his supply chain, his food aid. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes darting between the two of them, and for a split second, Okello saw raw panic in his eyes. Then, the mask of the bureaucrat slammed back down. With a deliberate movement, Thorne reached out and locked the tablet, the screen going dark. "This is inconclusive," he said, his voice flat and cold. "The sample is contaminated. The procedure was unauthorized. This data doesn't exist." "It exists," Okello countered, his voice rising. "We have the proof." "You have nothing," Thorne snapped, standing up, his authority returning like a suit of armor. "You will not speak of this to anyone. Not a soul. Do you have any idea the panic it would cause? The diplomatic incident? It would jeopardize the entire relief operation for this region. We would be shut down." He looked at them, his eyes like chips of ice. "This conversation is over. You will destroy your notes." He was shutting them down. He was burying the truth. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. They stood in the darkness outside the clinic, the cool air of Thorne's office already a distant memory. The humid night pressed in around them, thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of crickets. Sharma was pacing back and forth, vibrating with a rage so intense it was practically visible. "Protocol," she seethed, running her hands through her hair. "He's talking about protocol? We have evidence of mass poisoning and he's talking about causing a panic. I'll go over his head. I'll leak it to the press. There are channels for this. We can blow the whistle." Okello was still, his anger a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He looked past Sharma, towards the village. In the distance, a fire burned, a single point of orange light in the vast darkness. He could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of chanting carrying on the night air. A funeral. Another one, Sarah's. "Your protocols are in Geneva, Anya," he said, his voice quiet and grim. "My patients are here." He turned to face her, his eyes locking on hers. He is not just hiding data. He is not just protecting his career. He is letting them die, actively. He knows the cause, and he is choosing to let it continue. The fight went out of Sharma. Her furious energy collapsed, replaced by the cold, hard weight of what he had just said. He was right. This wasn't about rules anymore. The system they had put their faith in was not just broken, it was malignant. Okello's resolve hardened into something sharp and dangerous. "I will not let another child die for his optics," he said. He had made a decision. A new protocol was being written. His protocol. Later that night, the aid warehouse loomed in the moonlight, a vast, silent shed of corrugated metal. Okello moved through the shadows, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was a physician, a man of science, and now he was about to become a criminal. The lock on the side door was old and rusted. It took him less than a minute to pry it open with a tire iron from the clinic's Land Rover. The door groaned in protest as he slipped inside, pulling it shut behind him. The air hit him first. It was thick, stagnant, and heavy with a cloying, musty smell. The smell of damp and decay. The smell of fungus. He pulled a flashlight from his pocket, its beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. The warehouse was enormous, stacked high with hundreds upon hundreds of the white sacks of maize porridge. He made his way to the far corner, the place where the roof leaked, the place he had seen the delivery trucks being loaded from. Here, the sacks were not stacked neatly. They were piled in a heap, some of them stained with dark watermarks. He knelt down, running the beam of his flashlight along the seams of a sack on the bottom of the pile. And there it was, a fine, dark, velvety dusting of mold clinging to the polypropylene weave. He pulled a sterile sample bag and a pair of tweezers from his medical kit. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a cold, precise rage. He carefully peeled back the seam and collected a sample of the grain inside. It was discolored, slightly clumped, and it smelled of rot. This was the proof. This was the weapon. He sealed the bag, his mission complete. He was acting against the organization meant to save his people. He was breaking their laws, but he was obeying a higher one. The simple, absolute duty to prevent harm. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The small tent glowed from within, a fragile bubble of light against the immense dark canvas of the Ugandan night. Inside, Dr. Sharma worked with a fierce, unwavering focus. The sample Okello had stolen from the warehouse was their only shot, and their equipment was limited. She was running a liquid chromatography test, a delicate process to separate and identify the chemical compounds in the moldy grain. Okello stood by, watching, every muscle tense. The fate of his people, the truth of the plague, was being decided in the silent hum of their aging, portable machinery. Hours bled into one another. Finally, a graph began to form on the laptop screen, a series of peaks and valleys, meaningless to an untrained eye, but to Sharma, it was a language. She leaned closer, her breath fogging a small patch on the screen. A single dominant spike appeared in the data stream. She cross-referenced its signature against a digital toxin library. "There," she breathed, her voice a mixture of awe and horror. She tapped the screen. Fumonisin B1, a powerful neurotoxin produced by the Fusarium mold. It matches the neurological damage we saw in Sarah's brain tissue perfectly. She looked up at Okello, her eyes wide. "It's definitive, a dangerously high concentration. This isn't just a potential link, David. This is the weapon." They stared at the screen, at the clean, irrefutable line of data that condemned Marcus Thorne. It was the moment of scientific triumph they had fought for, bled for, and broken the law for. This was the proof that could stop everything. And in that precise moment, the steady chugging of the generator outside the tent sputtered. It coughed once, twice, and then died. The light, the hum of the machines, the glowing screen, everything vanished. They were plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the frantic chirping of crickets. They had the truth. And in an instant, the world had switched off the lights, leaving them utterly alone with it, isolated and powerless. The next morning, the system began to close in on them. The retaliation was not loud or violent, it was quiet, bureaucratic, and suffocatingly efficient. Okello went to get their Land Rover, the key in his hand, only to be stopped by one of Thorne's deputies. "Sorry, Doctor," the man said, not sounding sorry at all. "The vehicle is being reassigned for the vector control team's logistical needs. Mr. Thorne's orders," Okello argued, but it was like talking to a brick wall. The keys were taken from his hand. Their transportation, their ability to move between the scattered villages, was gone. Later that afternoon, their satellite internet connection was cut. Sharma was in the middle of uploading their findings to a secure server when the signal simply vanished. The error message on her screen was blunt. "Account deactivated by administrator." Thorne was cutting their lines of communication, severing their link to the outside world, to any authority higher than his own. They were forced to travel on foot, their investigations slowing to a grueling, dusty crawl under the relentless sun. The real torture, however, was watching the aid trucks. They still rumbled through the villages, now with guards riding alongside them. Men loyal to Thorne. Okello and Sharma would stand by the side of the road, helpless as the trucks rolled past, kicking up dust on their way to more remote settlements. They were watching the poison being actively distributed, watching the disaster spread in real time, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. They were physicians, armed with a life-saving diagnosis, forced to watch as the plague was knowingly administered to new victims, village by village. Each passing truck was a fresh wave of guilt and impotent rage. Days turned into a week. More children were falling sick. More fires burned in the evenings. Desperation was a physical weight, pressing down on Okello. He had the what, the mycotoxin, but he had no way to prove the who. He couldn't test every family, every sack of grain. His scientific tools had been taken from him. He had only one option left. He went to Elena's hut. He found the old woman sitting outside, weaving a basket, her fingers moving with a slow, ancient grace. He approached not as a doctor, full of knowledge and authority, but as a supplicant. He sat in the dust before her. "I need your help, Mama," he said, his voice quiet and humble. Eleanor stopped her weaving and looked at him, her eyes sharp and perceptive. She saw the exhaustion, the desperation, but also something new, the absence of arrogance. The doctor had come to listen. "I don't need to know about the Gemmu," Okello continued, choosing his words with care. "I need to know about the food. Your memory is the only history book this village has." He leaned forward. "Think back to the distributions, the trucks. Sometimes the sacks on the bottom are wet from the rains. The men are careless. Which families? Mama. Which families took the food from the back of the trucks? The sacks that were damp?" He wasn't asking about a curse. He was asking for data. He was treating her knowledge, her memory, as the valuable resource it was. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, a silent assessment passing between the old world and the new. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. She trusted the man he had become. She put down her basket and began to speak, her voice a soft, steady rhythm. She listed names. She pointed out houses. She recalled which child had carried which sack, which family had complained of a musty smell. She was providing a chain of custody, a detailed map of the poison's path through her community. Her traditional knowledge, the very thing Okello had once dismissed, was now providing the specific, targeted data his science desperately needed to build its case. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they followed Elena's information to its terrible, logical conclusion. They stood on a small hill that overlooked the village graveyard, a quiet, somber patch of earth dotted with wooden markers. From their vantage point, the fresh graves were starkly visible, small rectangular patches of newly turned red earth. Too many of them. Okello held the list of names Elena had given him. Sharma had her notebook, sketching a rough map of the cemetery. They began the grim task. "The Odong family," Okello would read. "They live by the old well. Elena said their sack was torn and wet." Sharma would find the corresponding plot on her map. "Here," she would say, her voice hollow. "A new grave. A small one." They continued, cross-referencing the names, the houses, the stories of the spoiled grain, with the fresh earth below. The correlation was perfect, a horrifying one-to-one match. Every name on Elena's list corresponded to a new grave in the cemetery. It was a mortality chart written on the landscape itself. They stood in the fading light, the list in Okello's hand, the map in Sharma's. It was their proof. Grim, heartbreaking, undeniable. It wasn't in a lab or on a computer screen. It was there, in the earth, quantified by the small bodies it now held. This was the true cost of Thorne's lies, of his carefully managed optics. And in the face of that terrible certainty, their resolve hardened into something unbreakable. The aid compound had been transformed. White tents were arranged in neat rows. Banners bearing the organization's logo flapped in the breeze, and a small, carefully selected group of international journalists sipped bottled water in the shade. It was a carefully constructed island of order and control in a sea of chaos. At its center, behind a podium, stood Marcus Thorne. He looked rested, confident, and immaculate in a fresh linen suit. He was delivering the grand finale of his fiction. "Phew, and so," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring, "thanks to a swift and decisive vector eradication program, we can confidently say that the primary transmission route for this unfortunate outbreak has been contained." He smiled, a polished, camera-ready expression. "We are turning a corner. The future for the children of this region is looking brighter." At that moment, two figures emerged from the dusty track that led to the village. Dr. Okello and Dr. Sharma looked like they had been through a war. Their clothes were dirty and rumpled, their faces were etched with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with a cold, clear fire. They didn't stop at the edge of the crowd. They began to walk through it, their pace steady and unwavering, their gaze fixed on the man at the podium. A few journalists turned, curious about the interruption. Thorn faltered for a second, his smile tightening. He saw them coming, and a flicker of the panic they'd seen in his office returned to his eyes. They kept walking, a two-person stormfront of undeniable truth about to break upon his stage-managed world. Okello reached the podium. He didn't lunge, he didn't shout. With a calm, deliberate movement, he reached out and took the microphone from Thorn's stunned hand. The low hum of the speakers was the only sound. Thorn stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the carefully prepared words of his speech dying on his lips. Okello turned to the crowd, to the blinking red lights of the cameras. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried an immense, shattering weight that commanded the attention of every person there. "My name is Dr. David Okello. I am the physician for this district," he began, his voice steady. "Mr. Thorn is correct when he says the children here are suffering. He is wrong about everything else." He held up a sheaf of papers in one hand, Sharma's lab report. In the other, he held the hand-drawn map of the village graveyard. "The problem is not in the river. The sickness is not carried by flies." His eyes found Thorn's. "The problem is in your warehouses." A gasp went through the crowd of journalists. Cameras began flashing, no longer aimed at Thorn, but at Okello. "The children are being poisoned," Okello stated, his voice ringing with the clarity of absolute certainty. "They are suffering from a neurotoxin called fuminicin. It is produced by a mold that grows on improperly stored grain." He held up the map of the graveyard. "This is a list of families who were given spoiled food aid from a contaminated batch. And this," he gestured with the map towards the village, "is a chart of where their children are now buried. The correlation is 100%. He paused, letting the horror of his words sink in. Then, Sharma stepped up beside him, a silent, powerful show of solidarity. She took the microphone. "The biochemical analysis is irrefutable," she said, her voice sharp and precise, the voice of pure science. "We have run chromatography on samples from the victims and from the grain itself. The molecular signature is a perfect match. This is not a theory, it is a fact. This outbreak is not an act of nature, it is the direct result of negligence." She laid the lab report on the podium, its stark graphs and chemical formulas a final, damning testament. The journalists surged forward, shouting questions, their cameras flashing in a frenzy. The focus of the entire world had shifted. Thorn, pale and trembling, was no longer the man in charge. He was just a criminal, exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth they had unearthed. The aftermath was swift and brutally efficient. Before the press conference had even fully descended into chaos, two quiet, severe-looking officials from the aid organization's head office appeared. They flanked Thorn, spoke to him in low, urgent tones, and then escorted him away, not with force, but with an air of finality that was far more chilling. The system was protecting itself, excising the cancerous limb before it could poison the entire body. The aid distribution was immediately and indefinitely halted, but there was no celebration. As the journalists packed their equipment and the officials made their whispered phone calls, a new sound began to rise from the village, a wave of voices. Okello and Sharma turned to see a crowd of parents rushing towards the clinic. The news had spread like wildfire, igniting a desperate, frantic hope. They swarmed Okello, their hands grabbing at his arms, their faces a mixture of anguish and desperate expectation. "You know the cause?" one mother cried out. "Is there a cure? Can you fix my son?" Another father held out his listless daughter, her head nodding rhythmically. "You are the big doctor who found the truth. Now make her better." Okello looked at their faces, and the hollow, bitter reality of their victory settled upon him. He had won the battle for the truth, but the war against the disease was far from over. "We know the cause," he said, his voice struggling to stay steady. "We can stop it from spreading, but the damage, for many of the children, the damage is done." He looked into their eyes and saw their hope curdle into a new, more profound despair. Knowing the poison's name did not mean he had an antidote. Science had given him the truth, but it could not offer him a miracle. The victory felt like ash in his mouth. A few weeks later, life in the village had found a new, fragile rhythm. The white trucks of the old aid organization were gone, replaced by the green trucks of a new one that operated with a quiet, meticulous transparency. Outside the clinic, Dr. Okello stood before a group of local mothers. He wasn't lecturing, he was teaching. In his hands, he held 2 cobs of maize. One was healthy and yellow. The other was discolored with the faint, telltale signs of grayish mold. "You look for this," he said, pointing to the discoloration. "And you smell for this, a musty smell, like damp earth. If you find it, you do not eat it. You do not feed it to your children. You burn it." Beside him stood Elena. When Okello used a word like mycotoxin, she would lean in and translate it into a practical, traditional Okello phrase the women would understand. The poison dust of the bad rain. It was no longer science versus superstition. It was a partnership, a dialogue. Okello looked up and saw Joseph sitting nearby. With the poison gone from his diet, the seizures had stopped. He no longer thrashed or fell. But the nodding, though gentler now, remained. His eyes were still distant, his mind a place no one could reach. He was a living monument to both their victory and their failure. A sharp cry cut through the afternoon quiet. A moment later, a midwife emerged from the clinic, a smile on her face. "It is a healthy boy, doctor." Okello looked from the distant gaze of Joseph to the clinic door, from which the cry of a new, untainted life had emerged. He exchanged a long, meaningful look with Elena, a look of mutual, hard-won respect. The world would never be whole again. The losses were permanent. But here, in the quiet determination to rebuild, in the fusion of old wisdom and new knowledge, in the defiant cry of a newborn baby, there was a fragile, undeniable hope. What's so fascinating about this story is that, in a way, the villagers' superstition was right. Not literally, of course. It wasn't a river devil causing the sickness, but their core belief that the plague arrived with the white sacks of grain was a more accurate observation of reality than the official scientific explanation being pushed by the aid organization. We tend to see these things as a simple battle between enlightened logic and primitive folklore. This story suggests it's more complicated. The villagers were practicing their own form of science. They observed a correlation. A new variable, the food aid, was introduced, and a new result, the nodding sickness, appeared. They connected the 2 dots. Their explanation for why they were connected was supernatural, but their initial observation was fundamentally empirical. The real conflict wasn't science versus superstition. It was honest inquiry versus corrupt bureaucracy. The breakthrough didn't happen when Dr. Okello's science defeated the elders' folklore. It happened when he finally listened to it, treating her memory as a valid data set that guided his own investigation. It makes you think about the value we place on different kinds of knowledge. We trust the lab report, but often dismiss the collective memory of a community as just stories. But sometimes those stories are data in disguise. It leads me to ask, where do you think the line is between a baseless superstition and an observation? We just haven't found the right scientific tools to prove yet.